Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be creating two clean and simple cards using the Fairy Kisses stamp set by Hero Arts. And I'm going to be creating alcohol ink, and it's not really going to end up being a background, but I'm using one alcohol ink and two of the alcohol pearls. And for the pearls, you're going to want to make sure that you shake that up really well because all of the pearly goodness settles to the bottom. There's like a little mixing ball in there. And I'm just going to place some drops of all three of my colors onto a piece of Yupo paper. And I'm not sure if you guys can see on camera, but the pearls, the alcohol pearls kind of react a little bit different. They kind of, it's kind of weird. It kind of looks like they're like sizzly. It's very hard to explain, but I'm going to add a little bit of the alcohol ink solution as well. And just put that aside to dry. I'm going to end up cutting this down. This isn't actually going to be a background, but I'm just going to kind of let it do its thing and put that aside. And we'll move on to the stamping and the coloring. I'm going to be using both of the larger images in the stamp set, both of these little fairies, one for each of my cards. So I'm going to bring out my Misty. This is the first time I'm stamping these, so just in case I don't get a great impression the first time, I'm going to be stamping these onto a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I'm going to be stamping them with Blackout ink by Ink on 3, because you guys probably know by now this is definitely my go-to ink, especially for Copic coloring. So I did go ahead and stamp these twice just to make sure that I did have a bold black outline for my images, and then we'll move on to the coloring itself. The coloring for the fairies themselves were pretty simple, but there is a lot of folds and creases in the one dress, so we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. We're going to start off with the skin tones first, and I'm going to be using the same color combination for both of my fairies. I'm going to be using a right light source for the bigger fairy and a left light source for the fairy on the right, just to make it a little bit easier depending on the way the direction they're facing. So I mapped out my darkest areas with my lightest color, and now I'm going in with that darkest color, just placing my shading mainly to the left hand side for her and underneath her little arms. She's got two little lines for her collarbone, and I'm adding that in as well because that would create a shadow also underneath her little chin and her little kneecap there. And for this little fairy here, I'm pretty much doing the same thing, only I'm adding my shading to the right hand side, also where her one leg is tucked behind the other. Going to go ahead and blend those areas out with my E11, which is my darkest midtone, including those little areas for the collarbone and the kneecaps and her elbow on the other fairy. You'll just want to make sure that you pay attention to the illustration itself. For a lot of the Hero Arts sets, they're super detailed, so just use those lines within the illustration to kind of guide you as far as where to put those shadings and shadows and things like that. So I'm on the E01 now, and this is my lightest midtone, and I'm extending all of those areas out, just leaving a very small area for my highlight color, which is the E00, that color that we started off with. So once the skin was done, I'll move on to the hair, and I'm going to start with the fairy on the right, and I'm going to be using some E50 markers. For hair, I typically go in with the darkest color first, just because I like to have a bigger highlight. And sometimes when you start off with your darkest color, your colors don't blend as much, which I don't really want them to for hair. Now, I missed her little ear there because honestly, I didn't know it was her ear until I started coloring her hair. So I'm going to go in with one of my skin tones just to color that in. But the shading for her hair is going to basically be on the top where her hair would normally be parted and where it kind of flips up on the bottom. And it's kind of wavy on the bottom. So I'm just kind of doing little C marks to create some texture there. Now for this other fairy's hair, I did not have any kind of rhyme or reason or technique for this at all. Her hair is very, very flowy, and it's kind of going everywhere and curly and wavy and everything else. So I pretty much placed the shading underneath her little crown and kind of random areas where her hair is kind of flowing in the back of her with that E15. Then I'm going to go over those same areas to kind of lighten those up. Well, not lighten them up, but brighten them up, I should say, and extend those areas out with the Y26. I'm going to make her kind of like a blonde, maybe like a dirty blonde. And I'm just going to extend those areas out and just preserve some highlights for some of the strands of hair, just to make it look as if it is pretty flowy. Going to go over all of her hair with the Y23, and this will brighten it up a little bit more and give it some movement. So next we're going to move on to her dress, and this is super, super flowy. So I'm going to start off with the top portion of her dress first. So her sleeves are creased or folded a little bit in on the bottom part of her sleeve. So I'm going to add a little flick there. And again, I'm starting with my lightest color. And now I'm going to go in with my darkest color. And you'll see that I just followed those lines within the illustration. For the main part of her dress there, I just added shading to the left-hand side underneath her arm. And for this part here, which I don't know what it's called, I know that there is a special term for it, but I don't know what it is. I'm just adding shading under each layer, where one layer is laying over another. That would create a shadow. And wherever her dress is creased, I'm putting a wavy line there. Now I'm going to go in with my mid-tone, and I'm going to extend all those areas out. And for those little creases within her dress, you'll want to make sure that you extend those out, but you're going to want to make sure that you extend them out in the same direction each time. It doesn't matter which direction. In this case, I went off to the right of that first flick with that darkest color. But if you go off to the left, that's fine. Just make sure that you go off to the left each and every time. Same thing with the V04, extending all those areas out, including those little creases, again, going off to the right-hand side in that same direction. The V01 is not my lightest color. It's my lightest mid-tone, and I'm just leaving a very small highlight for that V000, is it? Yeah, to the 000, and that will be my highlight color, and this will give the dress some movement. Now, for the rest of her dress, it has a whole lot of movement, so I'm not going to concentrate any light source because I can't do both. I'm just not, I just can't. There's too much going on here, but I am creating a shadow underneath that top portion of her dress, and then I'm just going to follow the lines within the illustration. Now on the bottom part, there is kind of some folds that are pretty clear where the back of the dress would show. So I'm creating a shadow there, and I'm just going to go over some of these lines. I'm not going over each and every one of them because you don't have to use your darkest color for every darkest area. Going in with the V06 and extending that shadow out, and all of the shadows that I had created for these little creases, again, extending those out in the same direction each and every time. But then I'm also going over the other lines that we haven't gone over yet. So this is my darkest mid-tone. I don't want the same color and depth throughout the entire dress. So this will make it appear as if some of these creases are a little bit more indented more than others by not using that same shadow color. Going in with the V04, extending those lines out, again, going in the same direction each and every time. Same thing with that V01, but I am also extending that shadow from the top part of her dress as well. And then there's going to be a whole lot of highlight area for this part, and that's okay. I just want there to be a lot of movement. And this is going to blend those areas out a little bit further, so they're not going to be as harsh of lines. Going to use that same color combination for her shoes, and I'm just going to be creating a little bit of shading towards the back of her shoes. So it would technically be the left-hand side, but they're also the back of her shoes, just leaving the tips where her toes are for that highlight color. For this other fairy's dress here, this one's a lot more simple. There's not as much going on in her dress. But I'm going to switch over to some R80 markers, and this is my favorite pink combination. So again, going in with my lightest color to map out those darkest areas. And there are some folds within her dress, so I am going over those, as well as the back of her dress kind of hiding behind the front of her dress, if that makes any sense. And then off to the right-hand side. Next, going in with that R89, which is my darkest color, and going over those same areas that we had mapped out, not extending my shadows up too far at this point. I'm going to leave some of that shadow area for my darkest midtone, which I'll extend out a little bit further than I did the first time and add a few more shadows than I did with that darkest color, because I don't want her dress to be red. I want it to be pink, and that R89 is pretty much red. So going in with the R83, extending those areas out even further, including the right-hand side of her dress. I did add a little bit of extra shading there. I just felt like it was too big of a highlight area. And then finally going in with that R81 to fill in the rest of her dress. And this will make it appear more pink, even though we did use a red for our shadow color. Use my colorless blender to fix up any areas that I went out of the lines, because I tend to do that quite often. And for the crown and her little star there, I'm just using the R02 and the R00. Not doing all that much shading. There's not a whole lot of area to do any shading here. So once it was all said and done, it pretty much looked like a solid color anyway. For their wings, I did want to add a little bit of color to these. So I'm going to bring in my BG72 and BG70. And the BG70 is barely noticeable. So I'm adding just a little bit of shading with the BG72 where one wing is behind the other and just at the base of her wings, and then use that BG72, kind of flick that out to white, which is almost white anyway, leaving the tips of their wings, leaving those white. So we went ahead and die cut these out, and now we are going to go ahead and assemble our cards. So I'm bringing in that alcohol ink piece here, and I'm going to cut this into strips. And I kind of moved this around, not sure how I was going to do this. And some of my areas didn't extend all the way out. So there's only certain parts of this panel that I'm actually going to be able to use because I need a full strip. I was going to make 2 landscape cards, but I ended up switching that up as well. So first I'm cutting 2 strips that are 1/4 of an inch long, and then I'm cutting 1 strip that is a 1/2 inch long. Then I am taking a piece of black cardstock to cut that, 3/4 of an inch. And same thing with the white cardstock, I'm cutting that 3/4 of an inch as well. So next I'm going to kind of play around with my placement before I stick anything down. My one card is going to have a black background. My other card will have a white background. So I'm kind of just switching up those strips. And one, I'm going to use the alcohol ink strip right on top of the white strip, if that makes any sense, just basically creating a little bit of a border. And I wasn't sure which fairy I wanted to use for which one. And the one fairy that's much smaller, I decided to use on the landscape card just because I had less room to fill, I guess. So I'll go ahead and adhere everything, and I'm using my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to go ahead and adhere my white strip onto my black panel and my black strip onto my white panel. And I'm just using my grid mat here to make sure that everything is lined up perfectly. And then I'll take the alcohol ink strip here and just place that right in the center using that same glue, and then just kind of place my fairy there to make sure that everything was good to go. And for this card, I decided to make this a portrait card because my fairy was quite a bit larger than the other. So I'm using my grid mat again to go ahead and line up my black strip. And obviously this is a lot longer than my card panel itself. So I just took my scissors to snip off the ends, and then I'll adhere my 2 little skinny strips of my alcohol ink there, one on the top, one on the bottom, just trying to place that the best I can. And the Yupo paper takes a little bit of time to stick, so I don't know what kind of adhesive you guys normally use, but the Tombow Mono Multi Glue usually sticks pretty quickly. This one shifted around a little bit, so the Yupo paper does take a little bit more time to set. But I just trimmed off those extra pieces with my scissors there, placed my fairy to make sure that everything was good for that one. So I'm going to take these scrap pieces of the black and the white cardstock, and I'm going to be using 2 different sentiments from the stamp set. For the black card panel here, I am going to treat both of them with my anti-static tool. For my black strip, I'm going to stamp that with my Versamark ink and then sprinkle on some Hero Arts white embossing powder. And for the white panel, I'm going to also treat that with my anti-static tool and stamp my sentiment with VersaFine Onyx Black ink and sprinkle on some clear embossing powder. So honestly, the black embossing is totally optional, being it's going on a white background anyway. But I just figured that that would make it pop. These are pretty clean and simple cards, so adding any kind of texture helps when they're this clean and simple. So I went ahead and heat set those, preheating my heat gun just for about 30 to 45 seconds before bringing that to the paper. And then I will cut these down into strips. And now these are more than just a sentiment strip. There's a couple lines to them, but I'm okay with that. Typically, I just stick to like 1 lines for sentiment strips. But in this case, we definitely did need to add a little bit extra to the card. So this will definitely help. Use my paper trimmer for this because like I've told you guys before, I cannot cut a straight line at all. So next we'll move on to, well, first I tried to, for this one larger fairy, her sentiment is about pixie dust. So there is a stamp within the stamp set that is basically the pixie dust. So I tried to use the alcohol lift ink on that remaining piece of the alcohol ink, and I guess the colors that I used were very pale, and I did that on purpose, but when you lift it, you can barely see it on the white cardstock. And I don't even know if you guys are going to be able to see it on camera, but once it was there, it was there. So I'm going to fix that later. And I just moved on to assembling the cards. So I'm going to take my Scotch foam tape and adhere that to the back of my fairy, and it also adhere that to the back of my sentiment strip, and go ahead and place that down, just lining her up with that pixie dust that I did stamp down, just in case you're actually able to see it. And for my other fairy here, I ended up, there's another stamp in there that I guess is for, she's blowing the fairy kisses. So I took out my white unicorn pigment ink by Hero Arts and used that to stamp on my background, my black background for the fairy kisses, and went ahead and stuck down my Scotch foam tape to the back of her as well as my sentiment strip and popped those down right in the same placement as I have them right now. Now to add a little bit extra here, I recently got the Nouveau Dream Drops, which are new. They are much different. Well, they're similar to regular Nouveau drops, but these are more of an iridescent and they dry amazing. They're beautiful. So I'm using the, what are they called? They are, one is the Indigo Eclipse and the other one is Love Potion. So I just kind of squirted those around. On the black panel, I used the pink, and I just went around those, that strip that we had created with the alcohol ink. And for my other one, I went right over my little pixie dust there, but you can't really see where I stamped out. I just went over making all different size dots to make it look as if she is sprinkling that pixie dust. But that is it. Those are the 2 cards using Fairy Kisses by Hero Arts. Thank you guys so much for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.